Do you think this peace deal is a pretext to just withdrawing Ukraine support by engineering a shoddy solution that Z will say no to? I mean, like, if Trump gives Putin everything he's offered and Putin does not take it, that would not surprise me a lot, because Putin might be like, wait, no, I'm not leaving here, son. I'm not leaving Zaporizhia. What do you mean? Because that might be like see, you have to at least compromise some bit for the Ukrainians, and they're not willing to at all, because they're like, what do you mean we won? We can't compromise in that way. We won. What do you mean? We won. We make the... And I could see maybe something like that making it fail. That would not surprise me, but I don't think it's like deliberately designed this way. I think Trump would very much like to say, look at me, I made peace. And the reality of the facts of like the interests of the two party on the ground make that very hard, especially when you consider European and Ukrainian interests, the interests of those on the ground, and the leverage both sides have and their fighting capacity currently. It's very difficult to produce unless you strong arm your allies into making concessions that they might not be willing to make, which is another failure point. Like if Trump says Ukraine has to give up all the land that is currently being occupied, and also Ukraine can't join NATO, and also there's going to be no American troops in Ukraine, and also we're going to withdraw troops from the Baltics, and he just keeps like, Ukraine can just say no. And while that means fighting without possibly American support, and that's going to be horrific, if you just concede all this shit and then have to fight another war again in 3 years without American support anyway, then I mean, like, what have you accomplished? Would the hope be, oh, well, maybe in 4 years, Democrats will be in office, and then, Kamala Harris or Pete Buttigieg, sorry, I'm trying to fix my camera, and Pete Buttigieg will save the day or something. No, bullshit. We can't, like, hope for that. And even if they were in office, can you bet that they'll control all the legislatures? And even if they did, they'll probably take a better position, but it certainly isn't going to be the best one. Dylan, tell me you love me too. I don't. Love you? Love. It's a hard word. That supposed mineral deal was total amateur crap. It was the kind of deal no one in the world would sign, not even an exiled African dictator. Yeah, no, it was awful. It was absolutely god awful. And we have to talk about it. We need to talk about this deal, and then we need to talk about the fear that Europeans have about Trump. Because this is, we're talking about some of the worse or like pretty, this is everything I feared about a Trump presidency with Ukraine. Not just that Trump could possibly turn off the tap, but that he would offer ways out that were kind of ways out, but was really just going to be him strong-arming them, either bleeding them dry for resources or trying to get as much out of them as possible, making it difficult for them to rebuild. Because if you are even able to gather a peace, maybe it's a good peace, maybe it's a bad peace, it'll probably be to some level an unjust peace. But if you're able to attain that, and then the Ukrainians are paying obscene debts and unable to take the capital that they are able to accumulate from foreign investors and from their, domestic taxpayers, and use it to, improve their society, to not only rebuild their damage, but, to improve the society, to show that a developed civil society is good.
_Veda has donated $15. Zero.
Hey, thank you for the 15 sign. I appreciate that. Thank you. That, having a developed civil society is good. Having a functioning democracy and judiciary is good. Not having to live under a cult of personality is good. Being able to have freedom of speech, a free press is good. Like these are things that can help develop your society. Having some amount of economic independence, so the state can't just like randomly do this or that with your resources or what's yours, is good. And that it will improve society. But if you instead are paying obscene debts that you are never going to be able to pay off, giving away all of your avenues towards improvement, towards investment, towards accumulating wealth and improving yourself, then you could be up shit creek because of the damage from the war, and then taking the paddle and giving it to the United States for scrap. And that seems to be the current offer from Donald Trump. The number that I saw publicly talked about multiple times, I didn't really want to take too seriously because the number was so obscene. Because what the Russians, just the nature of the ask made me kind of had a Freudian slip there. The current administration was asking for $500 billion in value in natural wealth to pay back for the aid that the United States has given Ukraine so far. Now let me say that again. $500 billion to pay back for the aid that Ukraine has been given so far. So this isn't $500 billion for $500 billion more in aid. This isn't $500 billion for this guaranteed amount of aid that we will get over this time frame that will make it so we'll be able to fight for the next 2 to 3 years to guarantee our sovereignty, and knowing Russian like armored reserves, they won't be able to last out, we'll be in a good negotiation. No, it was $500 billion worth of mineral wealth value for wiping Ukraine's debts with the United States over their aid, even though much of the aid was given with no debt implied, or some debts already given for the some of it that was given in a program of you're gonna have to pay it back. So what Trump is essentially saying is this is no longer an aid program. In fact, not only is it no longer an aid program, we're going to retroactively say it was never an aid program, and now you have to pay it back. It would be like going to a country that's suffering from a disease outbreak, saying, here's aid to deal with the disease, to keep you people alive. You take it, and afterwards you said, did we say that was aid? Oops, sorry, $5. You ever go to Hollywood? You know, like Hollywood and Los Angeles. Now, I don't want to talk crap about, Hollywood, California, because of the fires and such, but I'll be honest about at least one aspect of it. There's these music people who walk around and they have their DVDs and they sell them. They're hustling with them. And they'll come up to you and they'll be like, hey, you want this free DVD? They're like, oh, free DVD, oh, free stuff. We're Americans. We always like free things. We love a deal. We love a deal. So we take it, and they're like, do you want to make a donation? And they look at you. That's for $5, $10, $15. And you get hooked into the idea that, you've got the support, and then afterwards, they're like, never mind. Now look, Ukraine probably would have agreed since the get-go to go into some amount of debt in order to get the arms necessary to defend itself, considering the mass graves that were being filled and the threat for the very existence of the idea of Ukraine, or how Trump puts it, well, maybe Ukraine will be Russia one day. We don't know, But the reason we gave them aid wasn't because we were just the nicest guys, because we wanted to get some like mineral wealth at the end of this. Even though you could say any keeping of positive relations between state is under the implication you want to maintain trade, but it wasn't under any explicit or we've written it was under many different auspices. We wanted to maintain deterrence in Europe. We wanted to maintain American credibility when it comes to the Budapest Memorandum. We wanted to maintain European defense priorities and stability in Europe with our second largest trading partner. We had many other priorities for giving this to Ukraine, not to mention that Russia has generally been speaking considered an American strategic foe. And so all of a sudden just saying, oh no, this isn't even a talk about continued aid. This is a talk about you just settling your debts that you didn't even know you had. I find it incredibly scummy considering the circumstances Ukraine's in. And look, I've just talked about the implications as to why this is scummy. We already promised to do it in the 90s. We would send them aid. And so now we're kind of saying, oh, that's null and void. We never said that you wouldn't have to pay us for coming to defend you back. We're just, that's all scummy. But the amount is ridiculously scummy. Ukraine's GDP is about $170 billion. That's how much Ukraine's gross domestic product is. So $170 is the GDP. I'm sorry, I'm hitting it at home, but just 170. Trump is demanding $500 billion. How would you rebuild with that type of weight on your back? Ukraine would be, if to take that and put that weight on itself post-war and then try to rebuild. I mean, it would, you wouldn't be pushing a boulder uphill. You'd be pushing a boulder uphill with a backpack full of rocks and with shoes that are cinder blocks. You're putting a debt upon yourself that, given the circumstances, given the necessity of rebuilding, you're putting an undue tax on the people of Ukraine when they have enough of a burden to deal with. When you could say that the Ukrainian people, through their bleeding and sacrifice, through their sacrifice of not only their atomic arsenal when the United States made that demand, but also their assistance with American military initiatives, for example, the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, with Ukrainian soldiers dying in Iraq, whether it be Ukraine, ceding to American demands during much of the decade of conflict with Russia, the United States, Ukraine engaging in intelligence sharing and such. Like Ukraine, I would not say that Ukraine has treated us supremely unduly. In fact, Trump has been pretty upfront about the fact that Zelensky has treated him very well. He says that the phone call with Zelensky was very fine. Remember the phone call where Zelensky was called by Donald Trump and was told, hey, look, you got to give me information on Hunter Biden, dirt on him if you want these javelins that were already congressionally approved. And this is the theme with Trump. He doesn't seem to respect the Constitution at all, because he doesn't respect the Constitution at all. And back then, during that phone call when he was blocking the aid to Ukraine, which was congressionally approved, which is unconstitutional, he didn't respect the Article 1 power of the purse that Congress has, and he doesn't respect it now when it comes to the mass layoffs or the money that's being blocked that was congressionally approved funding. He didn't respect it then, he doesn't respect it now. It's a pattern of repeat behavior of Trump violating the Constitution. But when Trump was doing that, you know what Zelensky said publicly about it? He didn't really cover for him as in, oh, Trump is great, Trump is fantastic, but he didn't complain about the phone call. He kept his mouth shut, and Trump has paid notice, and he talks about it at his rallies. So Ukraine has been for us at the other wars. Ukraine gave up its atomic arsenal. Zelensky's covered for Trump. And now at the end of this long parade where the Ukrainians have entertained our knees clanging against each other for a decade up till 2022, when they gave them a bloody nose and we started to send them significant amount of military aid. And at the end of this road, we're going to say, we're going to put a bigger debt on you. And this is why we have the title as it is today, than what the Germans got at the Treaty of Versailles. Remember the Treaty of Versailles? The famously unfair treaty that was put upon the Germans at the end of World War I, that created tons of resentment amongst German society, that made it not only more difficult for the Germans to rebuild and for Germans to maintain like a daily life, but also created a type of resentment and a feeling of betrayal that it led to aggression in the society later down the line, and a pathway for Adolf to get to power. Big A, whatever you want to call him, to stop the YouTube algorithm from kneecapping me. $500 billion, $170 billion GDP, bigger burden than the Treaty of Versailles on Germany, the party in those negotiations which was considered the aggressor. Now, I don't want to get into the details about World War I history and whether putting all of the blame at the feet of Germany is fair. Placing all of it there obviously is not fair. But Russia is the invading power. Russia is clearly the aggressor. They said in the Budapest Memorandum they wouldn't invade, and then they invaded. And then they invaded not only Crimea and were lying about it the whole time, they invaded Donetsk, they invaded Luhansk, lied about the entire time, and invaded again in 2022. With the goal of either wiping Ukraine off the map or subjugating it. They're the aggressor, and what concessions have been gotten out of them? What concessions have been gotten out of the Russians? I don't know what concessions. I know that Donald Trump has said that we're not going to have U.S. troops in Ukraine, so we can't have that on the negotiating table. Okay, that's taken off. That's leverage. We could have said, you know what? If you don't want us to have troops in Ukraine, then you have to agree to this troop limit in Ukraine. Which I heard that Keith Kellogg, which is supposed to be Trump's special envoy, which I'm not seeing him do a lot of the envoying, you know, a lot of the like, where's the initiative? Why isn't he the one in Trump's ear leading him along this process, not to just give that up right out the gate, right? Even though Marco Rubio tried to backtrack a little bit, Trump kind of damaged that backtracking because of his lack of subtlety, which is in everything he does. But I mean, he takes U.S. troops out of U.S. troops in Ukraine as a deterrence. That's off the table. NATO membership. That's off the table. Implied territorial concessions. Boom. And now, after all of that concession to Russia, concession to Russia, we look over to Ukraine and we say, how about we put more debts on you? Let's put the Versailles-style debts on the nation that was invaded and victimized, that we all agreed was invaded and victimized, and that we told in the 90s would come to their defense if anything like this ever happened. Not only is this morally repugnant, not only is this disgusting imperial politics that will be seen as one of the more sinful actions the American government is engaged in the 21st century, it's not sensible. It doesn't make much sense to give this up all out of the gate and then put this debt at the feet of Ukraine. It's like you're asking for the Ukrainians to pull out. It's like you're asking for the Ukrainians to say, I know the bets are bad, but maybe we'll just have to go with the Europeans. Because they have to be seen, because if the pathway is, okay, no American troops, no NATO security guarantees. Okay, we're not getting that either. Okay, that's bad. We're not getting Ukrainian troops. I mean, American troops. That's bad. That's not good. But I mean, at least we are going to be able to rebuild. Oh wait, we have all this debt on us now, so we're indebted. No American troops. America is distracted elsewhere. No security guarantee. What deterrence are we putting in place here? And if they don't have an avenue to rebuild, then it's going to be an indebted, economically hurt and undermined state, which is 20% occupied, with no American troops in it, and no NATO deterrent. It's like you're asking for failure. It's like you're asking for failure. Now, this doesn't surprise me too much, exactly how crazy the request is. Mainly because the way Trump negotiates, and he talked about this in The Art of the Deal, is you aim high, you swing high, and then you keep swinging high until you get what you want. And maybe you'll get more than what you want. And this might make sense if you're, say, I don't know, negotiating a business deal with a rival company. But Ukraine's not a rival company. They're an ally. We have many of the same interests. If you bleed the rock dry, and there's no blood left for the rock, then the rock could die. The government services in Ukraine could not pay out pensions. They could not pay teachers. They won't be able to rebuild. Electricity won't be able to be maintained. Heating won't be able to be maintained. Public services, election monitors, the judicial system. And when the judicial system isn't well maintained, that festers corruption. And then the progress made in corruption could be retracted. And then at the end of all of this, what would the Ukrainians think they were fighting for? Not only were they backstabbed by the West, but what was all of this? If their society has decayed and all they were left at the end of this struggle, where they felt like they bled for European and American and Western security, and that they gave their fathers and sons for it, is all they're left with it is a dine and dash bill from the Trump administration for basically half of their resources. Listen to this. Donald Trump told Fox News that Ukraine had essentially agreed to hand over $500 billion. They have tremendously valuable land in terms of rare earth, in terms of oil and gas, in terms of other things, he said. He warned that Ukraine would be handed to Putin on a plate if he rejected the terms. They may make a deal. They may not make a deal. They may be Russian someday, or they may not be Russian someday. But I want this money back, he said. Trump said the U.S. had spent $300 billion on the war so far. He just throws these numbers out at random. adding that it would be stupid to hand over any more. Again, there's 3.8 billion that are just sitting there. He can send it any time. This is why he's not sending it. It's because of numbers that he made up in his head. In fact, the 5 packages agreed by Congress total are 175 billion, of which 70 billion was spent in the United States on weapons production, meaning American factories producing American jobs that will help produce American weapon stockpiles. And some of this also wasn't just weapons production, it was refilling of American stocks. So aid towards Ukraine and went towards making Americans weapons to defend America. Some of it is in the form of humanitarian grants, but much of it is lend-lease money that must be repaid. A new facility. I didn't come up with this. I'm taking it from them. My goodness. Bigger. By the way, when they say it was worse than the facilities treaty, they're not saying the one that was reformed. Listen to this. If this draft were accepted, Trump's demand would amount to a higher share of Ukrainian GDP than reparations imposed on Germany after the Versailles Treaty, later whittled down at the London Conference in 1921 and by the Dawes Plan in 1924. So he's saying that before it was reformed to still be unfair, but less unfair, this would be even more unfair than that. And this is the country that was invaded. My God. Here is a map of the minerals that Trump is drooling over. There's graphite, lithium, titanium, rare earths, iron, magnesium, uranium, all sorts of stuff. Now, you can see that there is a portion of this that is within Russian-occupied territory. Titanium, specifically, there's a decent size of supply of titanium. There's some rare earths that are over there as well. But a lot of it is in unoccupied territory. And so Ukraine would be losing by the end of this war, not only its rare earth metals that are in occupied territory, but then would be losing 50% of the remaining rare earth metals and a total amount of value upon Trump's original offer that's much bigger than their GDP.
Timo130 has donated $7.50. To be clear about my last dono, Israel does war crimes and upholds a terrible situation. I was drunkenly trying to make a war bad point.
Don't worry. I appreciate the buddy. Thank you, Timo. Thank you. So, obviously, this situation is quite concerning for the Europeans because they see this type of negotiating tactics from Trump where they don't really feel like they're negotiating towards a common goal, and they get a little concerned, like, wait, is that going to be how we're going to be treated? Are they not going to care about our security? I mean, he did talk about withdrawing from NATO a little bit, and there was a talk about not defending us if we don't spend the 2%, and that he would absolutely not come to people's defense. And I mean, these fears continue to increase. And after Vance's visit at the Munich Security Conference, and now the Munich Security Conference, it's a security conference. And so usually what's discussed is like ammunition production, you know, how many 155 NATO standard artillery shells can be produced. How are we going to be able to increase synergy between our states and integrate our defense capacity in the event of a war? How are we going to be able to meet spending targets? This is the type of stuff that's usually talked about. And maybe you'll talk about like the strategic rivals. Much of this is directed towards, say, Russia, China, maybe North Korea or something. But like a lot of times, of course, Russia. Instead of talking about that, instead of saying, hey, here is some old gear we have from the Cold War that we're able to scrape up and see if we can get over to Ukraine and increase their negotiating position because we want to have the best hand at the table, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of any of that, we're instead discussing like internet censorship online in like European countries. And again, my position is not that like somebody posting an offensive meme in Germany should be arrested. That's not my position, right? But I also don't believe that the Trump administration's premier complaint is about freedom of expression because they haven't behaved in that way.
I just had a big brain idea. Sign off mineral rights in the occupied territories. Then see Trump press on Putin to withdraw so he can get the goodies.
You know, I hear this a lot actually. I keep hearing from people like, okay, fine, you know what, you can have all the minerals in the occupied territory if you just get us our land back. And this is how a lot of colonial governments have historically gotten mineral rights is by like asking like people who were pushed out of their villages or homes, or like kings out of their kingdom, like, fine, we'll help you take it back if we get the land, if we get the minerals, or we get this, we get that. So I mean, there is quite a historical precedent for this, and I mean, like, Trump's engaging in some pretty old style, classic, remixed imperialism. So maybe you need to give him like the classic like vassal offer as well. But the thing is, Zelensky was made this offer that we're talking about, and he rejected it. He told his aides to reject it. Now, this is a bet that I think Zelensky is right to make. I think that signing away your ability to rebuild and showing that type of weakness immediately in the face of Trump, that you immediately concede all of your stuff to him, and then you sign away your country's ability to rebuild its natural wealth. Much of what your peoples are fighting for is like the wealth of its people and its future. You don't want to sign away your future after all the fighting and bleeding you did. It makes sense. And I also know that, like, I don't think those who end up doing good diplomacy with Trump, and good diplomacy with Trump is always like, let's just say we're grading it on a curve, and it's always kind of like handling a bit of a hand grenade. But I don't believe the people who got the most success by Trump are the people who went in there and brown-nosed him. Well, I do believe that, like, being nice to him to some degree and not being like an asshole, treating him with some amount of like respect, like he's one of the boys, I do think that goes a long way. But I don't think like, oh, here's a golfing trip, and hey, let's go feed the fish, and oh, let's do this, and oh, you're so great, and oh, wonderful. I don't think that alone is enough for Trump. I think that you standing up to Trump in a few instances to protect one of your key interests and making clear what your key interests are, making clear that these are sticking points that you won't be able to work around, and being strong in it is the way to work with them. And I think the people that have had success negotiating with them, both left wing and right wing, whether it be like Malcolm Turnbull from the Australia, or the Mexican authorities, as we just saw in Mexico, as like that 10,000 to 15,000 troop deployment that Biden also got at the start of his term, was able to push off tariffs. I don't think this is done through just conceding. In fact, I think Trump looks at it kind of like somebody like he's bleeding in the water and he's a shark. Okay, well, if you're bleeding right now, it's time to eat as much as we can. And so Zelensky's decision to reject it, I think, ultimately was very smart. But whether or not they're going to come up with a new deal, because I do know Zelensky brought Vance a new version of the deal that we don't have an agreement on yet. Europe is still in panic mode. Trying to recover from this cut in the Euro-Atlantic relationship that people are fearing is going to turn into a ravine. It's going to spread until there's a huge gap between the Atlantic. And I wanted to read you one of the concerns they had about the deal-making process, which would show a complete lack of European security priorities being considered in American defense planning, at least when it comes to like deal-making. Since Vance did open his speech saying he cared about European defense. Let me read you what this opinion piece from the Financial Times, written by Gideon Rachman, says after speaking to multiple European officials, which are anonymous. These are anonymous officials, so do consider that when hearing about the source. Trump clearly intends, and this is an opinion piece too, so he gives his opinion. Trump clearly intends to cut a deal on Ukraine with Putin over the heads of Zelensky and the Europeans. There could have been tragic consequences for Ukraine, which may soon be asked to accept loss of territory without security guarantees for the future. The alternative would be to try to fight on without American help. The implications for the rest of Europe are also alarming. Putin wants NATO troops removed from the whole of the former Soviet Empire. European officials believe Trump is likely to agree to withdraw U.S. troops from the Baltics and perhaps further west, leaving the EU vulnerable to a Russian army that NATO governments warn is preparing for a larger conflict beyond Ukraine. These types of words right here, this is red alert. This is a shifting of the dynamic. This is moving of red lines. This is the United States saying its security priority is not in the Baltics. And it could be taken as an implicit implication that if they were to do something there, the Europeans might do something, but the United States won't. And that might not be what the Americans say publicly, but that moving of the red line at this stage, under this administration, that could be very well what is taken. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania all have large Russian-speaking populations, like 15% of the population, something like that, right? Roughly speaking, 15, right? It's 3 different countries. With these countries having a decent size of Russian speakers, many of the arguments that the Russians have made in Ukraine about protecting Russian speakers, I have heard on Russian CTV and amongst the Russian war elite made about the Baltics as well. The Russian Empire used to control the Baltics. The Soviet Union used to control the Baltics. The Russian government would very much still like to control the Baltics. And if they could invade it and get away with it, and think they could get away with it, either through speed and confusion, as they did with Crimea, or just through overwhelming them through pure force, as they did with Ukraine. Well, they originally tried speed and confusion, and now they're trying to overwhelm them with sheer force, which is, that the verdict is still out on that. The Georgians also got that. Chechens, second time around. Then it would be a disaster it would obviously be a disaster for these countries, not only the destruction, but the loss of their civil society, the loss of their democracy, the likely vassalization of their culture, as was common under Russian imperial rule, and as we're seeing the wiping away of the Ukrainian culture in occupied territories. Maybe you could expect the same thing there as well. And these are all things that the Baltics are going to want to avoid. And the Europeans, seeing Ukraine fall and then the Baltics fall, are going to see it as a domino. And so they might very well draw the line there. Now, look, I'm not saying that this is how it's going to proceed. Definitely, because European states have atomic weapons, and they could try to make threats with that. They could try to make those threats credible. Maybe they can make the Russians reconsider. But why even throw this into question? NATO currently is an alliance of 1 billion people. You only need to, hold American security guarantees in the Baltics through a deployment of maybe 500 U.S. Marines. I'm not kidding you. You're like, with Dylan, 500 U.S. Marines can defend the entire Baltics. Diplomatically, yes. The purpose of putting troops like that there isn't necessarily even to stop a full-fledged Russian invasion. Number one, if we saw the Russians preparing for a full-fledged Russian invasion, we would presumably probably move other resources into the region. But it exists there to act as a diplomatic deterrent, as a message that says, if you attack this country, the United States will come. You'll not just be fighting Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. You'll be fighting Germany, France, the United States. You'll be fighting the United Kingdom. You'll be fighting an alliance of 1 billion people. And so it's just not worth it, bro. Just not worth it. And so moving the troops out of there, unless you could get some ungodly, beautiful concession. And I mean, look, we pulled troops out of the Baltics, and you're withdrawing out of all of Donetsk and Luhansk. Why would you give this up? Why? All we've heard about is concessions. All we've heard about is no NATO membership, no U.S. troops in Ukraine. Okay, well, no NATO membership and no U.S. troops in Ukraine. Can we at least get all the territory back? No, territory is going away too. Oh, well then, okay, what about the Baltics as well? Maybe that is a concession. When are we going to hear about a Russian concession? When are the Russians going to stop hunting humans in Kherson? When are the Russians going to say, you know what? Actually, the Ukrainians can have Kherson. They can have Zaporizhia. They can, in order to get back Kursk, we're going to have to accept that, maybe the next region, some type of back and forth, But everything has been concession. And we're just talking about the big concession. There's a bunch of little concessions too. Let me give you an example of one of the little concessions that I've seen. One of the little concessions that I see is normalization. where the Russians, who had been diplomatically isolated and viewed as outcasts by much of the world, not all of the world, but much of the world, are now being rebranded very quickly as, godly World War II patriots who, you just love the Russian government loves their country like everybody else. So what do you mean? And let me show you one example of this. Here is Mario Newfall. Breaking: Russia's Lavrov arrives in Saudi Arabia for U.S. talks on war. The main thing is the beginning of real normalizations between the U.S. and Washington. It's like, okay, well, them just meeting doesn't mean everybody's going to think they're cool and based, Dylan. People can still remember the war crimes and be able to parse through the nonsense. And just because Lavrov's getting off of a plane and he might shake hands with Trump doesn't mean that, we need to be stupid and pretend that that guy is not covering up for atrocities, or that guy isn't a part of the horrific war machine. That doesn't mean that, Dylan. Well, that would be true if the problem was that isn't how it's being treated. Case in point, just not really anyone important, just the richest man on the planet, Elon Musk. This is what competent leadership looks like. So this type of concession is made, you can say it's not a concession, but the North Koreans loved being able to trounce around Trump on TV when it happened. I mean, people knew that Jimmy Carter going to North Korea, now if it could produce a diplomatic victory, it'd be nice, but there's a certain normalization that happens. And that's the type of concession that's made. Another concession that's made is Ukraine's not at the table. That was a big one. Ukraine wanted to be at the table. The Europeans are currently not at the table in Saudi Arabia. But Lavrov and the Americans are. This is another concession. This is another thing the Russians wanted for talks. Where are the concessions from the Russians? Where are their concessions? I haven't seen any concessions. The only concessions I've seen have been completely on one side. And that worries me. That worries me tremendously. Because let me show you something, okay? The great and mighty Russian Federation. 140 to 60 million people. I don't know how much the birth rate has hurt the population as of recent. No, the war certainly hasn't helped. But the Russian Federation, this is supposed to be, up until recently, the second most powerful nation on the planet. Right? Second most powerful nation on the planet. Now, the United States can put aircraft carriers on every corner of the planet. We can't. We have satellites with our GPS systems that is top tier in communications software. Our jets are the most advanced jets in the world. Our spy software, the same. Our targeting software, the same. We're advancing in laser technology. Our atomic submarines, some of the best in the world. We have some of the most in the world. And then the Russians are right behind us. That was the message. Now, to be clear, a lot of that message was a crock of shit, right? Now, you know, whether it has to do with problems with corruption, problems with maintenance, problems with command, whether it has to do with problems with certain super uber weapons that didn't end up amounting to really all that much. You know, a lot of it was blown out of proportion. But on the other hand, a lot of it wasn't. They still got a lot of people. They have a huge arsenal of armored weapons, a huge arsenal of artillery, a huge arsenal of artillery ammunition. They also have a lot of natural resources to pull from. They have a large population base to pull off of, one that's 4 times the size of Ukraine. But due to the other failures, and due to how, you know, they have performed in this war and how this war has ended up proceeding, this is where we are. Do you realize what's in front of you? This is a BMP-1. This is a Soviet armored vehicle from, you know, the 1960s. So we're talking, this is right after Stalin kicked the bucket, right? Now, mind you, I can find worse examples. I can find Stalin-era tanks. And I remember showing this before. People said, Dylan, it's different. It's just support roles. No, they were frontline assault. They were within a few miles of the front line. I don't know. If you're blowing up 3 miles from the front, that's a front line, man. You were in an artillery range. you're in drone range. But I'm just using this as today's example. This is an armored vehicle, an infantry transport vehicle that's meant to move troops to the front from the 60s. Do you notice anything curious about this? Let me see if I have any nerds in chat. I've ridden in BMPs before, so I notice, but I'm curious if anybody else notices. I'll give a cookie to whoever notices. It's modified? Yes, it is modified. It is modified. You want to know how they modified this BMP-1 and set this off to the front? Well, first thing they did is they cut off the top, and then they removed the gun off the BMP, and then they replaced it with a 50 caliber machine gun. They took an armored vehicle from the Khrushchev era, and they scrapped the top, made it into a drop top, like you're going down the highway in Cali, and then replaced the gun with a machine gun. The Cabriolet BMP. Now, the BMP-1 is already not an extremely protective vehicle. In fact, I would describe the BMP-1 roughly as a tin can, that just about anything on the battlefield outside of basically small arms fire is going to be able to rip this thing to shreds. But to cannibalize you cannibalize a tin can, an 80-year-old something tin can, and then what is it? Not 60 years old, 60 to 70-year-old tin can, and then replace its gun with a machine gun. This is not the Russia of 3 years ago. Russia of 3 years ago was not the Russia of fairy tales. That fairy tale was slayed 3 years ago. And then the Russia of 3 years ago has been reduced in the last 3 years. And this is what we're left with. Now, say what you want, but if what was supposed to be the second most powerful military on the planet is using Corvette BMPs, drop-top machine guns, Stalin-era tanks in some parts of the front, and its average age for its contract soldier for the end of 2024 was 50 years old. I don't know if you guys knew that. At the start of 2024, it was already old. It was 40 years old. By the end of it, but the total average for the year was 45. But the reason the total average for the whole year was 45 is because the end of it, it was 50. 50 years old was the average for the end of 2024 going into 2025. The average ages of these soldiers are increasing. The quality of the equipment that Russia is able to put out into service as they're relying upon more North Korean and older and older and older Soviet gear is degenerating. It's degenerating. And you can only offer so many people to go over there and fight and die with the amount of money that Russia has. Russia's already spent a lot of money on the war. They've already spent a lot of money to try to control the economy to stop it from going belly up. Inflation's already up. The cost of living's already up. And then they're going to have to continue to increase the amount of money they're spending just to maintain the troop levels that they've got now because of the ever-degenerating nature of the Russian armed forces, because they cannot produce enough armored vehicles to keep up. And so, look, I'm not saying that Russia is gonna die tomorrow or it's an easy fight. What I am saying is acting as if we have no leverage, getting no concessions, or pretending that Russia is some fairy tale, a fairy tale that died 3 years ago, and a geopolitical opponent that reduced itself even more in those last 3 years. Because this isn't even the bad performance we saw at the end of the war. Russia has improved at the start of the war, but they've improved at the cost of so much of which is not replaceable, like the professional soldiers they lost at the start, or a lot of the gear that they lost, air defense systems, etc. So we need to act like we have leverage, because we do have leverage. We aren't going to the negotiating table with nothing. And if we do act that way, we got to also throw out there that these are real people. They're going to have to live under either Ukrainian or Russian rule. And let's take a look at Avdiivka for a second.
OG Smirnov has donated $10. Drone drop top. Smoking on BMP in the hot box. Effing on Putin, he's a asterisk.
Good flow, man. I respect the flow. I respect the flow immensely. But let's talk about what this reality of this deal making means on the ground. You sign away all this land. You sign away it all. Let's talk about what this means for the people on the ground. This is Avdiivka. I don't know if you guys remember, but Avdiivka was where the Russians got their teeth kicked in for a decade until, there was an aid hold in the United States. And due to a manpower differential, eventually the Russians were able to overwhelm it in 2024 after failing to take it for about a decade. Now, due to how long it took for them to take it and how fierce the battle was, the vast majority of Avdiivka, just as all of Bakhmut and many, many other cities, Popasna and many others, have been basically destroyed, decimated, or heavily damaged. And there was a report made recently showing that after Russia occupied the city a year ago today, they have repaired in a city of 30,000 people two buildings in 1 year. Russia invaded because they said they wanted to liberate people. Now, the massive increase in death and destruction already, I think, killed that myth a long time ago. The idea that they're coming here to liberate the Russian speakers, the people of Eastern Donetsk, these people right here. But also, now that they've captured the land, what are they doing with it? What are they doing with this land? Like for me, for you, maybe less for me because I know these people now, but like you can look at that map and you can be like, oh, that's just like a line there. But each one of these lines is a community. And if the Russians cared so little about these towns to treat them these ways in their war making and to recruit their sons into the LPR and the DNR, the LNR and the DNR militias, which were so butchered at the start of the war, how can you expect them to prioritize them when it comes to rebuilding Russian society when there's so many other problems with the Russian economy, with inflation, the cost of living, infrastructure, the armed forces, the tech and the sciences and development sector, and you're going to spend all of that replacing these cities that basically don't even exist anymore and are not going to be producing any economic capacity for your gigantic empire within the next decade or two, probably. At least the next decade. Like, it's not just a question of a line on a map. These details matter. Let me show you at least the report a little bit of the footage.
Светлана живет в Авдеевке всю жизнь.
Svetlana lived in Avdiivka. One second, I'll read it since it's. Svetlana has lived in Avdiivka all her life on a bicycle. What else can she do here? Slowly moving things from her old apartment to her new one. Life is slowly getting better? Of course it's getting better. You live in an apartment? Even if temporarily, but still with hot water. Heating. Because the houses are being renovated gradually, moving in there, they need more. If this apartment, as in all the neighboring ones, the windows are broken, and this is how people try to insulate the room. Elena insulated herself in the same way. Now she and her husband moved to a renovated house next door. Second floor, fifth apartment. New residents just recently returned to their Avdiivka. What we find here, we wash, we have to walk in something. From the windows of the renovated houses, the views are still like this. So to be clear, what they did is they went and they covered the two houses in the entirety of Avdiivka that it got fixed in over a year. And they decided that it would, I mean, look, I get filming inside there, I guess makes sense. But for me, the news report is all the other places. I mean, I see it the same way I see those houses that survived the LA wildfires. It's like one house amongst like 20 damaged or like 100 damaged. If it looks like, it still looks like the city just went through the battle and they're just like the lucky houses, not like there was repairs done. That's not a good sign. In fact, I would say that's a very bad sign. Oh boy. By the way, did you see recently with Trump's statements about the future of American aid to Ukraine, that Lockheed Martin has lost 13% value, and Rheinmetall, the German defense company, has gotten a 34% bump? Looks like the European defense companies are the only ones excited with America taking a back seat. More money for them. More money for them. Finally, a president that respects freedom of the press.